All right, Shevuos, say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin. A good Tavach, a good Erev Yom Tov, a Schos Baruch Hashem to begin another week of Maseches Shevuos together. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors. To thank our annual Talmud Torah sponsor for the year, Tafshin Pei Hey, the Tilsim Mishpacha of Eretz Yisrael, for dedicating all the Shurim and Drushos this year as a Zechus for Besaros Tavos for all of Am Yisrael. Our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Sivan Abba Lein Latova, Stephen Terry Zinn, for dedicating all the Shurim and Drushos this month in loving memory of Steve's mother, Doris Zinn Devora Bas Rabbi Yisrael Yoel Zichron Livracha. And their Daf Yomi sponsors for today, Yehuda and Bracha Buchwalter, Mazel Tov on the bris of their grandson, born to their children Nachum and Leah Rivka. Mand Mazel Tov, Rabbi Yehuda the name, Asher Zelig, Emeretz Hashem, Ze'akatan Gadol Yihya, Kishim Shenichnas Lebris, Ken Yikanis Torah Lechupo Lemaisim Tobim. Mazel Tov, Mazel Tov. Rabbi say with that, let us begin. As always, we dedicate our learning in the schus of our precious hostages. May HaKadosh Baruch Hu Emeretz Hashem bring them home b'shalom and b'karav, and in the schus of our holy soldiers, may they be successful b'chol ma'aseh yedehem. So say, let us be, we have a great sugi ahead of us today. Today's daf is Lamed Aleph, and our Rabbi Richter got onto the top of Lamed Aleph, once again making me look bad every single Shabbos. But all right, fine. But we're going to pick up Emeretz Hashem on Lamed Amud Beis. I want to start the sugya on, just in a complete way. We're picking up 5 lines up from the bottom. Tana Rabbanon. So Gemara says as follows. So Lamed Amud Beis 30b Tana Rabbanon. Tana Rabbanon minayin ledayin shelo yases sani goron ledvarav. Both is a very profound Gemara. How do we know? If you look at Rashi, what does it mean? Now, sanigor, a lesson of sanigor is a defense. How do we know that a dayan should not defend his position? Both said, what does that mean? It sounds like a dayan should defend his position. So Rashi HaKodesh says, about 8 lines up from the bottom, in dan din v'libo nokfo. Let's say a judge adjudicated a case, and his heart is, libo nokva literally means, it literally means like his heart is beating. What it means is he feels uncomfortable with his legal decision. Lomar shu toeh, his heart's telling him, you know what, there's something that's not right about this. Lo yachzik dvarav lahavi rayos, la'amidem shu bo shlachzar. He shouldn't try to justify his position because he is embarrassed to recant. Rather, what should he do? He should endeavor to try to adjudicate the case correctly. Now, I will say this is a profound Gemara because this is not something that not judges alone deal with, but this is all of us deal with this, right? We encounter situations like this all the time where I espouse the position, right? I articulated a particular approach, and I know in my heart that it's really not right. I know that it's not right. So we'll say 9 out of 10 times, what do we do? Right? We double down. Like I overcompensate to show ultimately again that I'm incorrect. That I'm correct. I overcompensate instead of having the humility to say, you know what? I was wrong. The Gemara Masechah Shabbos says the hardest words for a person to say, is Eini Yodea. I don't know. Even harder than I don't know is I'm wrong. Right? In fact, the Gemara says, Lamad l'shoncha, you have to teach your tongue to say Eini Yodea. It's hard. So the Gemara says there are times in life where although I've taken a position, deep down I know the position is wrong. So how does the Gemara says, how do you know? Find the courage to say you were wrong instead of doubling down and cementing a flawed approach. How do I know this? The Gemara says, Midvar sheker tirchak. Ultimately, again, distance yourself from sheker. How do we know that a dayan should not have an unworthy student in front of him? Now, again, I will say the idea over here is because even the dayan should talk things out with someone. So how do I know if the person who the dayan is talking things out with is not a worthy individual? Once again, it's going to corrupt the outcome. Talmud Lomar, midvar sheker tirchak. Distance yourself from sheker. I will say, if you notice over here, the common denominator in all of these things is these are situations where, again, is it overt sheker? Having an unworthy student in front of you is it overt sheker? No, but it could lead to wrong things. So how do we know that if a dayan knows that one of the other judges is a gazlan, or a witness knows that his fellow witness is a gazlan, how do we know that you should not combine with that, right? You should not sit on the Beis Din with such a person, or should not sit to form a testimonial unit with a person. Talmud Lomar, midvar sheker tirchak. Ultimately, again, distance yourself from sheker. Now, what's the chiddush over here? The chiddush over here is that, let's say, if I'm a witness, I know that I'm saying the truth. I know that my fellow witness is saying the truth. So over here, there's no sheker occurring over here. And I want to say this is quite fascinating because we recognize, the halacha always recognizes the idea that all of us are made up of multiple parts. And some of those parts are good and some of those parts are not good, right? No one is an absolute. But still, when it comes to judgment, I can't participate in a judicial process, whether it's in the capacity of a judge or the capacity of a witness, if I know that the other people involved are dishonest. I can't. It just corrupts the entire thing. Midvar sheker tirchak. Good. I'm sorry. Good. Minayin l'dayin yodea b'din shumeruma. So we'll say, how do I know that if a dayan knows that the legal proceedings are corrupted? Shelo yomar hoil va'edim me'idin achatchenu v'yehei kolar top of lamed aleph kolar tav tzaloi b'tzavar edim. So listen to this. How do I know that a judge shouldn't say the following? The judge knows that the legal proceedings are corrupted. He knows that something is not right over here. But essentially what he says is, not my problem. Not my problem. The witnesses are giving their testimony, and if there's fallout because what they're saying is false, it's on them. How do we know that a judge shouldn't say that? Talmud Lomar, midvar sheker tirchak. Distance yourself from sheker. Abosai, this is so profound because what this case is highlighting over here is the not my problem approach. Right? I'm involved in something. I know that the process is not good. I know that the outcome is not good. And sometimes in life it is so easy to say, you know what, it's not my problem. I'm a judge. There's a process. There are witnesses over here. They're going to say what they're going to say. If they check out, they check out. And if there's a problem, it's on their head. It's not true. If you're involved in some way, it's your problem. You know, this is reminiscent of Baal Shem Tov HaKadosh. The Rebbe said that in this world, there's nothing we don't see that HaKadosh Baruch Hu didn't want us to see. And there's nothing we don't hear that Hashem didn't want us to hear. And if we see it and if we hear it, it's because HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us to do something about it. So often in life we see broken situations where we say, okay, not my problem, not my problem. If it wasn't your problem, you wouldn't have seen it. If it wasn't your problem, you wouldn't have heard it. If you're there, if you're present, and now you're knowledgeable, means HaKadosh Baruch Hu saying, it is your problem. Try to do something to remedy it. Incredible. Minayin l'talmid sheyoshev l'fnei rabbav v'ros kos liani v'chov la'ashir minayin shlo yishtok. How do we know that if a student is sitting before his Rebbe and the student sees some type of schus, he sees not a benefit, what's the word? A proof, yeah, is a better word. Okay, he sees something that would slant the judgment in the direction of the ani, and would be a chov, would indict the usher. How do we know that the student should not be quiet? So over here, this is a different kind of case. What this is talking about over here is essentially a student is always obligated to be deferential to his Rebbe. But again, how do I know that over here, if I'm deferential and I'm silent, that could lead ultimately again to perversion of justice. So how do I know that in that type of situation I shouldn't be silent and I should speak up even in front of my Rebbe? Talmud Lomar, midvar sheker tirchak. Incredible. Similarly again, how do I know if I see my Rebbe making a mistake in halacha, in judgment? Shelo yomar, I shouldn't say, Amtin lo ad shigmerenu. So you know what, I'm going to wait till my Rebbe passes the psak halacha, and then v'astirena ve'avnena mishali. Then I'll deconstruct the ruling, and I'll reconstruct it with my own logic. K'dei shikra den al shemi, and this will be my rise. This will be my rising to prominence. Talmud Lomar, midvar sheker tirchak. So I'll say. So again, what's fascinating over here is in the previous case, what the Gemara was highlighting was the idea that midvar sheker tirchak says, even though there's a normal code of conduct, and a Talmud should not go ahead and contradict his Rebbe, if the Talmud sees a potential perversion of justice, the Talmud has an obligation to stand up. In this case over here, midvar sheker tirchak, I will say, is passing. What's occurring in this case? What's occurring in this case is the Talmud says, I'm going to speak up, but I'm going to wait. I'm going to wait till the psak din is delivered. Then I'm going to add in all of my fancy lumdis. Right? I'm going to add in my drishos v'chakiros. And then I'm going to go ahead and have my Rebbe's din overturned. I'll be the spiritual hero, and it'll become known through my name. So the Gemara says, this Rabbosai, Midvar Sheker Tirchak, this is fascinating. This is Midvar Sheker Tirchak when it comes to ego. A lot of times when it comes to fueling the ego, we engage in practices that are not false. They're not false, but they're not good. They're not good. So therefore, again, the Gemara says, is be very careful when it comes to your ego that you don't engage in practices that are really not correct. Minayin, rabo, yodea atabi. It was incredible. So how do we know if the Rebbe, in this case, the Rebbe is speaking to the Talmud, and the Rebbe says like this, Yodea atabi, my Talmud, you know about me, shenoslinli meya mana eni mevada. You know, so the Rebbe says to the Talmud, you know, my Talmud, I'm very honest. I'm very honest. Even if somebody gave me, $1 million, I would not go ahead and pervert the truth. Mana yeshli eitzel ploni, ve'imli alav ela eid echad. So the Rebbe then says to the Talmud, here's my problem. What's my problem? I lent Reuven $1,000, and I only have one witness to testify to this. So what is the Rebbe essentially asking the Talmud? Would you mind just going ahead and combining with this other Eid Echad, so that now I have two Eidim to extract the money? There's only one problem, one little itty-bitty problem, which is what? The Talmud has no first-hand knowledge of this loan. But the Rebbe is saying is, you know me, and I would never lie about something like this. So I'm asking you essentially to trust my credibility and essentially combine with this Eid Echad. So the Gemara says, Talmud Lomar, Midvar Sheker Tirchak. Therefore, the pasuk says no. Midvar Sheker Tirchak. The Gemara says Midvar Sheker Tirchak. Midvar Sheker Tirchak. Nafka havadai shakuri kamashakri. V'rachmana amar lo sana bereacha eid shaker. So the Gemara says this is not Midvar Sheker Tirchak. This is what? This is false testimony. This is false testimony. Essentially, again, my Rebbe is asking me to testify about a loan for which I have no first-hand knowledge. And he's asking me to combine with another witness for testimonial purposes. Again, on both sides, the whole chap of Midvar Sheker Tirchak are these cases that are not overt lying, but they are still dishonest. They're still dishonest. This case is overt lying. So the Gemara says, no. Ela kegon da'amrile v'adei chad sahada isli v'ta'ata kum hasam v'lo temalo v'lo tema v'lo midi. The Gemara says, listen to this, Rosai. Rather, what is my Rebbe asking me? Rebbe saying like this. Listen, I have one witness that I lent Reuven $1,000. Here's what I want you to do. I don't want you to say anything. I just want you to come to Beis Din and stand next to that other Eid Echad. Just stand next to him. He's going to do all the talking. Daha, first wide line, Daha lamafkis mipumach shikra. You don't have to say a word. I'm not asking you to say a word. Now, what is my Rebbe essentially asking me to do? What is he asking me to do? He's asking me to provide the appearance of being an aid. In other words, by me showing up in Beis Din, standing next to that other Eid Echad, even though the other Eid Echad is he's going to be doing all the talking. I'm not saying anything. My presence is just a presumption of a second aid. So the Gemara says, so again, really all I'm doing is I'm showing up in Beis Din. I'm standing beside the talking witness. I don't have a talking part. I'm not saying anything. But obviously, my presence is creating the presumption that there is a second aid involved over here. The Gemara says, don't do it midvar sheker tirchak. Incredible. Next, minayin. Listen to this. I lend my friend $1,000. Shelo yomar et aenu b'masayim k'dei shiyodeli b'mona v'yischayiv le'shvua v'agalgel alav shua mimakom acher. So say, this is great. Listen to this. I lend Reuben $1,000. I lend $1,000. So I say like this. Okay, I know Reuben's going to give me back my money. I know that. But here's the issue. I have another outstanding matter against Reuven that he denies, and I was never able to impose a shvuah upon him. So here's what I'm going to do, because it's actually a great chap. I'm going to go to Beis Din, right? I'm the lender. I'm going to go to Beis Din. I'm going to say, Reuven, you owe me $2,000. What is Reuven going to say? What's Reuven going to say? I only owe you $1,000. What do we call that? Moda b'miktsas, partial admission. What's the halacha by partial admission? Shvuah. Now, I will say, whenever someone is taking a shvuah in Beis Din, there's a concept called Gilgul shvuah. Gilgul shvuah is essentially, once you're already swearing, well, we're going to roll in a whole bunch of other stuff that normally would not warrant its own oath. So this is my chap. I need Ruvain to take a Shevuah about a different scenario, which for whatever the reason couldn't generate its own Shevuah. So I'm going to come into Beis Din, make a fraudulent claim. Now again, I'm not really trying to collect $2,000. I'm just collecting my $1,000. What I'm trying to do over here is create a scenario through which Ruvain is going to be obligated to take a Shevuah. So how do we know again that this is not appropriate? Talmud Lomar, Midvar Sheker Tirchak. Okay, incredible. Supposed to listen to this. How do I know? I lent, right, Ruvain, let's reverse it. Ruvain lent me $1,000. Now, Ruvain's coming into Beis Din claiming that he owes me $2,000. Now, sorry, that I owe him $2,000. Now again, what Ruvain's motivation is this? Let's say Ruvain really thinks the loan was for $2,000. So I say like this. If I admit that I owe him $1,000, then what? I'm going to be chai b'shvuah. Instead, what am I going to do? Listen to this. Shelo yomar ach perena bebeis din. I'm going to be kofer bakol. Now, what's the halacha if you're kofer bakol? What's the halacha if you totally deny the obligation? Then you're pater. You're pater. So my chap is, I'm going to totally deny anything, that I owe Ruvain nothing. V'odelo chutz lebeis din, but I'll give him the $1,000 outside of Beis Din. Kidei shelo achayiv lo shvuah, v'lo yigalgel alai shvuah mimakom acher. So I'll say in this case over here, so then whereas in the previous case it was the lender playing games, over here it's the borrower playing games, right? So I'm the borrower, I borrowed $1,000. Ruvain rolls into Beis Din and says that I owe him $2,000. My chapa was like this. I know that if I admit that I owe him $1,000, I'm owed b'mikzas, then I have to take a Shevuah, and then he could roll in a show from everywhere else. I say like this, you know what? I'm going to deny the claim. I'm just going to deny the claim. Now again, I'm not trying to not pay back Ruvain. I'm going to deny the claim. I'll pay him $1,000 outside of Beis Din, but I'm not going to go ahead and admit anything in Beis Din. That way I avoid the whole Shevuah. So the Gemara says, how do you know you shouldn't do this? Talmud Lomar, Midvar Sheker Tirchak. So say you see the common denominator in all of these cases is Midvar Sheker Tirchak says, don't try to manipulate the system. Even though, again, which as I was supposed to say, in all of these cases, a person is using the halachic system for their own gain, for their own benefit. The Gemara says, don't do that. That's Midvar Sheker Tirchak. Next, a great case also. Although, again, they are great chaps. Each of these cases are really great ways to manipulate the system if you're looking to game the system. Listen to this. How do we know that if three people lent a mana to Ruvain, shelo yehei echad baldin u'shnayim edim, kedei sheyotzi mana v'yachloku. So let's say again, Ruvain, Shimon, and Levi all lent me a mana. Now again, the issue over here is now they want to extract it. So perhaps the easiest way for them to extract it is for the three to become two groups. One of them becomes the lender, and the other two become witnesses. Now they could all show up in Beis Din. One of them is the lender, two of them are the witnesses. They can extract the money like that from me. Now both say, now remember again, the reason why why is that false? Because again, they're not witnesses. All three are lenders. And the halacha is that a lender, any party to a transaction, cannot be the witness on the transaction. But they figure over here it's just easier. Let one of them be the lender, the other two be the witnesses, and extract the money like that. Talmud Lomar, Midvar Sheker Tirchak. Therefore, the pasuk says, distance yourself from falsehood. Minayim l'shnayim sheba'olu din. So some other very interesting cases. How do we know that if two people come to Beis Din? Echad lavush smartutin, ve'echad lavush itztelis basmei amana. So say, now watch this. Ruvain and Shimon show up in my Beis Din. And what happens? So Ruvain is dressed in rags. Shimon is wearing the highest fashion, beautiful clothing. The Gemara says, "She'omrim lo lavush kamoso, or he'll be kamoscha." We say to Shimon, the wealthy guy, "Here's your choice: either dress Ruvain like your dress, in other words, give him a proper outfit, or you dress like him." In other words, that halacha l'maisa, both litigants have to be dressed in the same way. Talmud Lomar, Midvar Sheker Tirchak. Therefore, the pasuk says, "Distance yourself from Sheker," which Rabbi says is a profound idea. What's the yesod of this Gemara? Rabbi say the yesod of this Gemara is we absolutely judge a book by its cover. It is so important. You know, we like to say, people like to think that they're not judgmental. It's false. We're all judgmental. We're highly judgmental. Someone walks into my Dalet Amis, I have them sized up by the way they dress, by the way they present, by the way they talk. And if someone tells you they don't do that, they are lying. They are lying. We all do it. It is the default reflexive judgmental kite that each of us possesses. Now, the avoda then is to kind of unwrap that afterwards, right? Now, after I do that, the goal is, okay, I want to get to know you. I want to get to see you. But it is very important to understand that that is the reflex. And I will say, by the way, it's not a bad thing. Why is it not a bad thing? Why is it not a bad thing? It's part of one of the most important and innate things or drives that Kadosh Baruch Hu has given us, which is self-preservation, right? In other words, the idea is because I assess everyone, I'm always on the lookout for things that are threats to me. That's the Kadosh Baruch Hu, which is good. In other words, I'm always on alert for things that Chas Shalom. So therefore, again, by definition, anything that comes into our Dalet Amos, we're always assessing. That's how we can assess a threat. That's how we can assess friend or foe. So by definition, this is how we see the world, and it is so incredibly important that we are judgmental. We size people up within the first 30 seconds of speaking to them, how they look, how they dress, how they talk. So therefore, the Gemara says, even great Rabbanim do this. Say, come into Beis Din, just know, Beis Din is going to see two guys. One is well-dressed and one looks like a shmata. Beis Din is going to form their perceptions of these people and their case within the first couple of seconds of meeting the presence of Beis Din. Therefore, neither litigant should have an unfair advantage over the other. And therefore, halacha l'maaseh, we say to the wealthier of the two, you have the choice, right? Because the poor guy doesn't really have much wardrobe choice. So again, at the end of the day, your choice is either you go ahead and dress like the pauper or give the pauper a nice outfit. Okay, incredible. The Gemara says, Kiyava asa, the Gemara says, Kiyava asa l'kamei de Rava. Interesting is when litigants would come before Rava, Baravuna, Amar lahu, Shlufi puzmakaichu v'tosu ladina. He would tell them, take off your shoes, and then come to din. So I guess apparently, again, people came in with different types of footwear, right? So again, in order that no one should look more chashav than the other, people would take off their footwear, and then they would come in for din. Incredible. Minayim l'dayin shlo yishma divrei bal din chaver kodem shevo bal din chaver l'din. So we'll say bal din chaver. So it says, how do we know that halacha l'maisa again? What about the following case? So Reuven and Shimon are in front of Beis Din. So let's say Reuven gets there early. How do we know that the dayan should not listen to Reuven, right? They should not engage in any type of conversation about the din Torah before Shimon gets there. Talmud Lomar, midvar sheker tirchak. Incredible, makes sense. Now, by the way, so again, if you notice, this midvar sheker tirchak has a very wide application, right? So again, you see it really applied in multiple ways. So in certain respects, midvar sheker tirchak means don't manipulate the system, which was like a lot of the cases we saw beforehand. Well, I should say, we started out this morning with midvar sheker tirchak means if you know something to be untrue, no matter how much time you have invested in that shita, in that particular position, be courageous enough to go ahead and walk away from something, even though you've invested a lot of time in building it up, but if you know that it's untrue, find the courage to walk away from it and find the courage to gravitate towards truth. Then we got into a whole bunch of cases of manipulating the system in order to go ahead and create a reality that you want, even though, again, the manipulation itself is not really true. Now, in these last cases, it's about giving an unfair advantage to one of the litigants, right? If they're dressed differently, different footwear, speaking to one of the litigants before the other, that's also midvar sheker tirchak. So the Gemara says, Rav Kahana masni, Tamalom midvar sheker tirchak. Minayin lebaldin, shel yatin dvarav, l'dayin kodem shiyavo baldin chavero. So also it's very interesting. So in the previous case, the Gemara was talking to the dayan. So judge, do not listen to one of the parties before the other party gets there. Midvar sheker tirchak. Now the Gemara says, talking to the litigants, how do you know that halacha l'maisa, if the other party is not there, you should not start talking to the judge about your case? So the Gemara says, minayin lebaldin shelo yatin dvarav l'dayin kodem sheyavo baldin chavero. So litigant, how do you know that you should not begin to put forward your case before the judge, before the other litigant gets there? Talmud Lomar, midvar sheker tirchak. Rav Kahana Masni, Rav Kahana had a different drasha. He said, Milo sisa lo sasi. So remember again, The pasuk is Lo Sisa Shema Shav, right? So literally, again, do not go ahead and take Hashem's name in vain. Al Tashes Yadchem Rasha Dios Ein Chamas. So Rav Kahana darshan it of Lo Sasi. Lo Sasi means do not place. This is the prohibition upon litigants not to corrupt the judicial process. In other words, there's two different prohibitions over here. A dayan is not allowed to hear one litigant before the other, and the litigants are not permitted to start putting forward their case until they are both assembled for the adjudication of the case. Incredible. Va'asher lo tov asa b'sochamav. Shevuos is actually a pretty incredible Gemara as well. So the Gemara quotes the pasuk from Yecheskel. Va'asher lo tov asa b'soch amav. So a person did not do good in their nation. Who is that? So the Gemara is darshaning this to mean inappropriate practices. So who is someone who's not engaged in good behavior? Rav Amar zehaba b'harsha. All right, so the Gemara said this is actually very interesting. If you look at Rashi, Rashi says over here. Rashi is right across from Tosos v'Rabbanon. If you see that Tosos v'Rabbanon, go right across Rashi. Zehaba b'harsha u'misaber alriv lo v'shem harishon noach lo v'noach lefrash. So this is very interesting. Okay, so apologies in advance to the lawyers. So listen to this. So the Gemara says, Barsha means someone who lawyers up. Someone who lawyers up. Someone who has, someone who comes and they have a lawyer representing them in the Din Torah. What's so bad about a lawyer? So I'll say this was interesting, is that the Gemara understands that when people who are engaged in a dispute come to a Beis Din, people are often more interested in finding resolution than lawyers. All right? In other words, a lawyer is a third party who's been brought in. And why was the lawyer brought in? Why was he brought in? Why? To win. To win. So because he's brought in to win, therefore, again, a lawyer often has very little reason to settle. As opposed to litigants, because they're the ones who are supposed to remember, again, also, Bepashtas, if there's a judgment between two people, often what that could mean is those two people had a relationship with each other. So because there's a pre-existing relationship, they may be more predisposed to ultimately settle. So, but again, if Reuben's bringing in a lawyer, the lawyer, again, may be coming to play hardball. The lawyer, right, may be coming to win, and he doesn't necessarily have a pre-existing relationship with the other litigant. So therefore, the Gemara just says, it's interesting how the Gemara understands over here, what does it mean a person didn't do good in his nation? This is someone who brings in a lawyer. Brings in a lawyer because now what you've done is you've pretty much negated any possibility of compromise and instead have created potentially a more litigious situation. I will say, obviously, just understand. The Gemara, of course, understands that there are times where, of course, a person needs representation and a person needs someone else to help guide them in the proceedings. What the Gemara is really talking about over here, it is in a situation where, let's say, where people make complicated situations more complicated. Right? And at the end of the day, there's a way to resolve disputes, and there's a way to navigate this, and there's a way to walk into a Beis Din with another Jew, and to go ahead and settle things in a sense of yashrus. So if you complicate it in a more situation, that's not good. Obviously, there are situations where the case is too complicated. I can't navigate it on my own. Okay, so Chazal are not faulting someone for bringing in an expert who could help you navigate it. Where the Gemara is faulting you is for taking a complicated situation and making it more complicated. That sometimes is an unforgivable offense. Shmuel says, Zehalokech sada sheyesh ala asikin. This is interesting. So Shmuel says, what does it mean? What does it mean? Vasher lo tov asa b'soch hamav. What does it mean? He didn't do good. It's someone who buys a field whose ownership is contested. Don't buy contested property. Don't buy contested property, right? Because if you do so, ultimately, again, you're just looking for trouble. Incredible. All right, Rabbi, that brings to a close our Midvar Sheker Tirchak Sugya. Absolutely incredible. Next. Supposed to remember again, the topic of our parak so far is Shevuos Ha'edus, right? We're talking about the testimony, the oath about testimony. Again, we'll see actually in the next Mishnah how this oath is actually administered. But the Maaseh, again, the Mishnah said it only applies. Obviously, Shevuos Ha'edus only applies to people who can give testimony. La fuge mai. So what does this come to exclude? Amra Papa, la fuge melech. It comes to exclude a king. Now this is actually very interesting that halacha lemaisa that a king, the melech Yisrael is not permitted to testify and not permitted, in other words, he's not permitted to testify and no one is permitted to testify about him. Oh, he's coming to exclude the gambler. The gambler, Mesachik Bekovia, ultimately, and I will say, we saw this in Mesachik Sanhedrin, is excluded ultimately again from testimony. He's pasal eidos. So the Gemara says, Manda Amar Mesachik Bekovia Kol Shekein Melech. So one who says that the gambler is excluded, certainly a king is excluded. Now why is that? So again, Rashi points out over here, why is the gambler, why is he excluded from eidos? So remember again, the Gemara said that he's Eino Osik B'Yeshuvo Shal Olam. He does nothing beneficial for humanity. Now, to point out over here, this is not the guy who goes on the Brotherhood trip to Atlantic City, right? Remember those days, right? So this is talking about a career gambler, right? This is a guy who his parnasa ultimately again is gambling. So the Chazal felt about such an individual like this, she'ena osek b'yeshuvo shel olam. He contributes nothing positively to the world. So such a person like that has zero credibility. Zero credibility in the eyes of halacha. So understand, that psul is a drabanan. The psul of a melech, right, that a king can't go ahead and give testimony or be testified about, that ultimately again is a daraisa. If you look at Rashi says, Kol shekein melech, de midaraisa lo chazi. A king is disqualified from anything to do with testimony midaraisa. Why? Dechsev som tasim alecha melech. So the pasuk says, place upon yourself a king. Shetehei emaso alecha. His fear has to be upon you. So therefore, we'll say, listen to this. Therefore, because the fear of the king has to be upon me, therefore what? No one is giving testimony against the king. Right? Now, if you can't be testified against, it also means that what? You also can't testify, right? In other words, we'll see actually, those are corollary concepts. If someone can't give testimony against you, then you have no ability to give testimony for or against anyone else. So therefore, if you're going to say the Mesachik Bakovia, the gambler, can't give Shevuos eidos, or can't be Shevuos eidos, that's only Psum D'Rabbanan. So if that's true, then certainly applies to a king who is Daraisa. But ultimately, again, the one who disqualifies the king from Shevuos eidos, then perhaps again Mesachik Bakovia was only disqualified midrabanan. So ultimately, again, midaraisa is totally kosher, and therefore maybe he would be fit ultimately again for Shevuos eidos. So we'll say it happens to be that halacha l'maisa, we paskin that both of these individuals are precluded from eidos, right? Both the king. Now the king is precluded midaraisa. Som tasim alecha melech, place the king upon you. The reverence and fear of a king has to be upon you. As a result, the king can't testify, and the king can't be testified against. There's complete, almost like judicial immunity. Now, again, it does not mean that the king is above the law, right? There is a recourse that the Sanhedrin has against the king, but just stam a person to give eidos against the king, or the king to give eidos against the person, ultimately does not occur. But the Mesachik Bakovia Rabban Paskins is also precluded from Shevuos eidos, because he excluded from eidos. Let's go back to bifnei beizin, shal bifnei beizin. So the Gemara says, so now if you remember again, we had a machlokes in the Mishnah between Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim. And the machlokes in the Mishnah between Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim was really about the following case. Rabbi Meir held that whether or not you're taking the Shevuos eidos right yourself, or ultimately again you are doing it mipi acherim, someone else is adjuring you, Rabbi Meir says it has to be done bifnei bezdin. Right, bifnei bezdin. Chachamim said it's only if you're taking the shvuah through someone else that it has to be in bezdin. Otherwise, if it's of your own volition, you could do it in bezdin itself. So the Gemara says, what are they arguing about? So this is actually quite fascinating. But what are they arguing about? The Gemara says, Amrua Rabban Echmei Drapaba, Badon Mina Umina, Badon Mina V'oki Ba'asra Kamefli. Okay, so let's talk this out for just a second. We're going to see that Shevuos eidos is actually learned out from Shevuos HaPikadon. Now, we have not learned about Shevuos HaPikadon just yet. But essentially, Shevuos HaPikadon is like this. I entrust something with Ruvain. I give Ruvain a Pikadon. Pikadon means an object I'm giving to Ruvain for safekeeping. Ruvain claims something happened to the Pikadon. He lost the Pikadon was stolen. there's something called the Shevuos HaPikadon, where I could make Reuven swear about the Pikadon. Okay, like I said, we haven't learned about it yet. We're going to see it. We're going to see now that Shevuos HaEidos, in certain respects, is derived from Shevuos HaPikadon. Now, whenever you learn something out from something else, right? So in this case, so let's say I'm deriving B from A. Let's say through a Gzeira Shava. So now we'll say there is a fundamental exegetical machlokes. What's the exegetical machlokes? When you learn out B from A, so how does that limud work? So there's what's called don mina umina, which means learn out B from A, and therefore B will take on all of the qualities of A. Or there's don mina va'oki ba'asra, which means learn out B from A, but after you learn out the original halacha of B from A, then all the other qualities should be derived from B. Okay, that's the machlokes. We're going to see it now inside. So here we go. So Rameir holds don mina umina. So Rameir holds learn out essentially Shevuos HaEidos from Pikadon, and learn out all of the elements of Shevuos HaEidos from Pikadon. That's what it means, don mina umina. Here we go. So the Gemara says, mi Pikadon, ma Pikadon, mushra bi'atzmo chayiv. So we'll say, so ultimately, again, just like by Pikadon, if a person takes a Shevuos HaPikadon of their own volition, ultimately, again, they're chayiv. In other words, the Shvuah works. Af Eidos, mushma mipi atzmo chayiv. So too in a Shevuos HaEidos, if a person takes their own Shevuos HaEidos, not in the presence of Beis Din, it works. The Gemara says, umina, furthermore, learn it out from Pikadon, ma Pikadon, bein bebeis din, bein shelo bebeis din, af Eidos, bein bebeis din, bein shelo bebeis din. Just like a Shevuos HaPikadon can be taken inside a Beis Din or outside a Beis Din, so too Shevuos HaEidos ultimately, again, can be in Beis Din or out of Beis Din. Beautiful. So we'll say, so that's Rabbi Meir. That's Rabbi Meir. For Rabbanon Sabi, Rabbanon will say, don mina va'oki basra, right? Which again, literally, learn out Shevuos HaPikadon, Shevuos HaEidos from Pikadon, but then again, learn out the rest of the halachos from Shevuos HaEidos. How so? Ma Pikadon mushpa mipi atzmo chayiv, just like Pikadon, ultimately again, if the shomer takes the Shvuah on his own, right, on his own, he's chayiv. Af Eidos mushpa mipi atzmo chayiv. So to Shevuos Eidos, if you take the Shvuah on your own, you will be chayiv. Va'oki ba'asra, but then establish the halacha again by Shevuos HaEidos, ma mushma mipi achirim bebeis din, just like by Shevuos HaEidos, right? If you take the Shvuah mipi achirim, it has to be in Beis Din, in shelo bebeis din lo. Af mushma mipi atzmo bebeis din in shelo bebeis din lo. So too again, so just like by Shevuos HaEidos, if you're being adjured by others, the Shvuah must be in Beis Din, and if it's outside of Beis Din, it won't work. So too, if you're taking the Shvuah on your own, the Shvuah only works if you're taking it ultimately again in Beis Din. Outside of Beis Din, it won't work. That's the position ultimately again of the Rabbanon. Shalom Beis Din lo. Good. So Amar Beis, Amar Lu Papa. So Papa says 1 second. Imi Pikadon Gemirila. So Papa says, I'm not sure that that's correct. If we're learning all this out from Pikadon, so the Gemara says, I'm sorry, Amar Lu Papa. Imi Pikadon Gamali Rabbanon. Tekuli Amalo Pliyi Dedon Mina Umina. Everyone agrees that if you're learning out Shevuos HaEidos from Pikadon, that the way to learn that out is learn out all of the elements of Shevuos HaEidos from Pikadon. Ella, Hainu Rabbanon. What's the logic of the Rabbanon? Because we'll remember again, what is the point of contention over here? The point of contention over here is in the following case. According to a mayor, right, the Rabbanon hold mipi achirim ein chayavin achich bruim Beis Din. The point of contention over here is when you are mushpa mipi achirim, if someone else is adjuring you to take the Shevuos HaEidos, does that Shvuah have to happen in Beis Din or not? The Rabbanon say, again, if you're taking the Shvuah on your own, even outside of Beis Din is fine. If you're taking the Shvuah adjured by others, only in Beis Din, not out of Beis Din. Rabbi Meir, on the other hand, holds no matter how you're taking your Shevuos HaEidos, it's got to be in Beis Din. That's the machlokes over here. So now the Gemara says as follows. So Rabbi says, if we're learning out from Pikadon, then everyone agrees, don mina umina. So what's the logic of the Rabbanon over here? So we're trying to figure out, according to the Rabbanon, Why is it that, again, we're making this distinction? If you're taking the Shevuos HaEidus on your own, you could even do it outside of Beis Din. But if you're being adjured by others, it's got to be done in Beis Din. It's Kavachomer. What's Kavachomer? If you're going to go ahead and be Chai Shevuos HaEidus, then certainly, again, you're going to be Chai Mipi Atzmo. And since you learn from Kavachomer, Dayo Lava Minadin Leos Kinidon. Then ultimately, in general, so when you make a Kavachomer, so remember again, so the halacha is there's a sense of Dayo. Dayo means that ultimately, again, the Kal could become no more Chomer than the Chomer itself. Ma Mushba Me Piacherim Be Beis Din, just like Mushba Me Piacherim is going to be in Beis Din, the Beis Din in, Shaloba Beis Din Lo, Af Mushba Me Piatzmo. Beis Din in Shalo Beis Din Lo. So therefore, we'll say based on the Kavachomer, we say like this. Just like if it's Mushba Piachim, if you're being adjured by others, so that only works inside of Beis Din, outside of Beis Din it doesn't work. So to again, Mushba Piatzma will only be again in Beis Din and not outside of Beis Din. Amar li Rabbanan Papa. So Rabbanan said to Papa, 1 second. Mi matzes amris dala bedon mina umina pligi. Is that possible to say that they're not arguing on don mina umine? Vatan, we learned. Vatan gabe pikadon. Shevuos HaPikadon, so we'll say back to Pikadon. Shevuos HaPikadon nohages ba'anashim u'benashim berechokim u'bekrovin b'kshirim b'psulin. So we'll say, remember again, Shevuos HaPikadon. Again, we're going to get to this in just a couple of days from now, after Yom Tov. Shevuos HaPikadon applies to men and women, relatives and non-relatives, ksherin and psulin, bifnei Beis Din, v'shelo bifnei Beis Din, in front of Beis Din, not in front of Beis Din, mipi atzmo u mipi achirim. Ultimately, again, whether you're swearing yourself or you're adjured by others, eino chayiv ad sheyichbar bo bebeis din divrei Meir. Rabbi Meir holds you only chayiv for Shevuos HaPikadon in front of Beis Din. The Chum say mipi atzmo, mipi achirim, kevan shekafar bo chayiv. The Chum say whether you swear yourself or are adjured by others, ultimately, again, if you swear falsely, you are chayiv. So again, where do we ever see in the case of being adjured by others in a Shevuos Pikadon? Where do we see according to Rabbanan that you're chayiv? Lav de gamri la me'edos. It must be that we're learning out Shevuos HaPikadon from Shevuos HaEidos. Ushma mina bedon mina umine pligi. And therefore, again, they must be arguing about the extent of a gzera shava. And as we both say, don mina umine or don mina v'uki ba'asra is a fundamental machlokes about how to darshan a gzera shava. So mostly that's what they're arguing about. To which the Gemara says, you're right. The Gemara says, the Gemara says, you're right. That is what they're arguing about. Here's the difference. You could see that from the Mishnah of Shevuos HaPikadon, but you would not see that ultimately, again, by the Mishnah over here of Shevuos HaEidus. So from Shevuos HaPikadon, from that Mishnah, which we'll get to in just a couple of days, it becomes clear that that is, in fact, the root of their machlokes. But ultimately, again, from our Mishnah, you might not necessarily see that. Okay, so we'll say, so what do we take from here? So first of all, what we take from here is a very important principle in the darshaning of a gzera shava, right? What is a gzera shava? A gzera shava is you find commonality between two scenarios. That commonality could be a word, it could be a phrase, it could be a concept. And what does that do? That allows you to go ahead and create a halachic bridge between A and B and learn out different concepts one to the other. So the shaila is, in general, when you learn out a gzera shava, how does that work? So let's say, for example, I'm a gzera shava between A and B. So I'm going to learn out elements about B from A. So the question is, how does that process work? So there are two different mechanisms. There's what's called don mina umina, which means learn out B from A, and essentially all the elements of B will resemble A. Or don mina v'uki be'asra means no, learn out the initial concepts of B from A, but then look at the unique elements of B and establish those as your new reality. And again, that's the machlokes. And again, it's a machlokes. It's a machlokes. It's one of these things that you see throughout Shas about how to darshan ultimately again a gzera shava. What about here? What about halacha l'maisa again in this situation about Shevuos HaEidus? How do we paskin regarding a Shevuos HaEidus? Remember again, we have this machlokes, Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim. So Rabbi Meir holds that in general, Rabbi Meir holds that halacha l'maisa, Shevuos HaEidus only takes place in Beis Din itself. The Chachamim understand that halacha l'maisa, that if you are being adjured through others, it's only in Beis Din, but ultimately again, mipi atzmo, ultimately again, even outside of Beis Din. How do we paskin? The Rambam paskins like the Chachamim, and therefore again, halacha l'maisa, if you're being adjured by others, that Shevuos ha'edos must take place in Beis Din itself. If, however, you are swearing of your own volition, that shvuah could even take place outside of Beis Din. That's how you pass like the Chachamim. Good. Let's go a little bit weiter. So the Gemara says as follows: So again, if you intentionally, right? So it sounds like if you intentionally violate Shevuos ha'edos, you are chayiv. What does this mean? So the Mishnah brought down a case of literally again shigigasa, the shogeg, with zidon ha'edos. What does that mean? Rabbi Yehuda, did I skip? Sorry. The chayav al zidon shvuah. Sorry. And you are chayiv for intentional violation of the shvuah. So Gemara says, minhani mili, what is that? The Tanah Abanon, Rabbi say, now here's what's interesting. In general, we saw beforehand that there are other types of shvuahs that if I intentionally violate, there's no chiyuv. Yet here by Shevuos ha'edos, interestingly enough, if I intentionally swear falsely that I don't know Eidos, I am chayiv. So by all the other cases, it says v'ne'elam, that the shvuah was hidden from you. V'kan lo ne'emar v'ne'elam. Here it doesn't say v'ne'elam. L'chayiv ala meizid k'shogeg. Teach you that what? I am liable ultimately again for meizid just like shogeg. So whether, we'll say, so therefore again, whether I intentionally take a false Shevuos ha'edos, in other words, I know that I know testimony, but I purposely swear that I don't know testimony, or I forgot that I knew testimony and I swore to that effect. Either way, I am liable for the false shvuah. Furthermore, again, you're also liable for shogeg with zdon ha'edos. Now we'll say, now what does that mean? So hechi dam shigagasa and zdon ha'edos. Listen to this. Ba'omer yodea ani sheshvuah zu asura. I know that the shvuah I'm taking is asur. Which Shabbos means I know that I know testimony for Ruvain. And I know that I'm swearing falsely that I don't know testimony for him. And I know that this was asur. Aval ini yodea im chayavin ala karban imlo. What don't I know? I don't know about liability. So in other words, I know what I'm doing is wrong, but ultimately, again, I don't know about liability. That's called zidon shvuah. That's called a shigagasa im zidon ha'edos. So I'm shogeg in what sense? I don't know what my liability is, but ultimately, again, I know that what I'm doing is incorrect. Incredible. So we'll say there's liability for that case as well. But you're not chayiv for just plain shogeg. And I will say, now what this means is as follows. What this means is, let's say, right, Ruvain says, Silber, you know testimony for me. And I say, really, like, I don't. And it turns out that I really was shogeg. Like, in other words, I really thought that I did not know testimony. I forgot about this case. And then it turns out that I really did know testimony. In that case, the Mishnah says, and therefore I swear, I actually take a shvuah, I swear I don't know any testimony. And then later on, it becomes clear to me that I really do know testimony. So I swore incorrectly, but it was a total shogeg. There's no liability for that. So lema tanina d'Ravkan of Dravasi. So the Gemara says, so should this not go ahead and answer up the question that Rav Kana Ravasi, and I will say, look at Rashi, Lema tin Rav Kana Ravasi, Tehechad desavra lishava be'emes, eno chayiv, v'amai istapik lehu, districh Rav lemeimar lehu libcha nascha. Shabbos said, this was actually a question of Kana Ravasi brought up before, which is, if someone really thought that they were swearing correctly, but they really swore falsely, what is there liability in this case? Now, interestingly enough, Rav Kana Ravasi brought this up as a question. You see, based on our Mishnah, that it's clear that there is not liability in this case, right? Because in this case over here, I'm swearing Ruvain, I don't know any testimony for you. And I believe that I'm swearing correctly. It turns out that I was swearing falsely, albeit accidentally. And what does the Mishnah say? There's no liability in that case. So Rav Kana Ravasi asked this kasha. The Gemara left it as like a kasha. The Gemara is essentially saying, why is it a kasha? Why didn't they answer from our Mishnah? To which the Gemara said, the Gemara said, lo afagav disnan istrich. No, even though our Mishnah says it, the Gemara still have to go through the process. Why? I might have thought that maybe it's only by Shevuos ha'edos, maybe only by Shevuos Eidos, if I end up swearing falsely, but not intentionally, but because I really thought I didn't know any Eidos, that's the case where there's no liability. Aval Hasam Dichsev V'ne'elam, but let's say by Shevuos Bitui, where it says V'ne'elam, Afilu Shigagasa Kol Duhu. So we'll say maybe by Shevuos Bitui, the Havamim is, maybe by Shevuos Bitui, even though when I swear, I think I'm swearing correctly, maybe if it turns out that I swear falsely, maybe there is even liability in that case. Kamash Malon, that there's not liability in that case either. So I will say, bottom line, and this is actually very important, halacha l'maisa, any case where you swear falsely, but you are absolutely convinced that you are swearing correctly, there is no liability in that case. Very, very important. Shevuos Ha'edos, that is true. Shevuos B'tei, so for example, right, if I swear, Shvua sha'achalti kikar zu hayom, I swear I ate a loaf of bread today. And it turns out that's what? That I didn't. But I was so sure that I did. Halacha l'maisa, there's no liability in that case. Same thing, right? Reuben says, Silber, you know Eidos for me? I swear, Reuben, I don't know what you're talking about. And again, when I swear, I'm 100% convinced that I don't know what I'm talking about. Therefore, halacha l'maisa, again, is what? There's no liability in that case. So both say anytime you swear falsely, but at the time you're swearing, you think you're swearing correctly, there's not going to be liability in that case, whether it's Shevuos Eidos or Shevuos Eidos. It's interesting, by the way, the bookends of today's daf are quite fascinating. Right? How did we start today? We started out today with a dayan who had built up a particular legal construct that at one point he was convinced was correct, but then he became what? Aware that what? It's not correct. It's not correct. And the Gemara says, have the courage to admit that you were wrong. Have the courage to go out and deconstruct that which you constructed. Right? Have the courage to go out and walk back that din, even though, again, you built up this whole legal construct. Midvar sheker tirchak. If you know that you're wrong, don't double down. Don't double down. Walk it back. But yet again, the Gemara also acknowledges that there are other times in life where what? Where we're really convinced that we're correct, but it turns out that we're that we're wrong, and that happens. That happens. Both of these scenarios. If you know you're wrong, don't double down. Find the courage to walk it back. But on the other hand, fully recognize that there are times that we are convinced that we're correct, but it turns out that we're fundamentally wrong. So in those, interestingly enough, if you know you're wrong, but double down and refuse to walk it back, there's liability for that. If you think you're right, but it turns out that you are unequivocally wrong, the halacha says, for that, there's no liability. Why? People make mistakes. If you make a mistake and you really didn't know, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, okay, there's not liability. But if you make mistakes and you know you are absolutely wrong, but you doubled down and you didn't walk it back, for that, there absolutely is liability. I say, Shkayach, stop over today, pick up with the Mishnah tomorrow. What a start to the week. Shkayach, everyone, a good Yantiv.
Why does Rashi say that is in a issue with Shalom, not that it's a gospel?
Well, it's right because because